Okay, so anyone who's joining us on the recording, welcome to the program on demystifying affordable housing, lessons from Winchester. I am going to turn it over in just a second to Andrea Adams, land use and permitting consultant, and for a conversation moderated with Marty Jones. Soon. Apologies, everyone. Slight bit of tech issues. More than a few tech issues. You all able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to introduce Andrea Adams for tonight's presentation. Andrea is a land use planner who has worked for a variety of public agencies during her career. In Rutland, Virginia, and on Cape Cod, working for the Cape Cod Commission, Andrea reviewed development proposals and evaluated residential, commercial, and industrial developments, as well as worked on local comprehensive campaigns. Most recently, she was the senior planner for Watertown, Massachusetts, our neighbor. In Watertown, Andrea was the town's affordable housing specialist and managed the development review process. She also staffed the planning board, the historic commission, and the historic district commission, and wrote various ordinances and zoning texts and map amendments. She has extensive civic engagement experience working with local boards and citizens in many communities to increase support for affordable housing. And tonight, Andrea is going to be joined by our very own Winchester, Marty Jones. Marty Jones has lived in Winchester since 1987. She's an urban real estate developer and economic development strategist who got her start at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, working in both Washington and Boston. She then moved to the private sector where she worked for, I'm going to say this wrong, Corcoran Jennison, a Boston-based real estate development company for over 30 years. Her work focused on development of mixed income communities, affordable housing, public housing redevelopments, as well as hotel and commercial properties. From 2011 to 2017, she was president and CEO of Mass Development, the Commonwealth's quasi-public economic development authority. The agency closed $20 billion in transactions, supporting over 1,600 projects, including 12,000 housing units during her tenure. Marty continues to provide consulting services to mission-driven organizations, including supporting the Network for Social Justice, and serves on the Winchester Housing Partnership and Affordable Housing Trust. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our presenters for tonight and back to the presentation.
Great. I will kick it off, and thank you so much, Leora and Caroline, for both of your organizations sponsoring this and continuing the conversation among Winchester residents about affordable housing and ways we can continue to make progress in our community on the affordable housing scene. We're going to start out tonight with a little bit of history. I know a number of you who've been thinking about and learning about housing have spent some time learning about redlining and zoning and how those have affected affordable housing development. But this next slide that Leora is going to manage our slides for us.
Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. This next slide is going to dig us right into a little bit of affordable housing history. And tonight we're going to be talking more about money and financing and how development deals get done so that people can understand a little bit about the rules and regulations and funding that's available for affordable housing. So we're going to go back to 1937. After the Great Depression, as everybody knows, the federal government was stepping up to create lots of new programs, social programs to help America come out of that depression. One of the big programs that was created was the public housing program, the federal public housing program in 1937, which basically said that local entities, local housing authorities would get money from the federal government to build and operate public housing for low and moderate income people. So that started way back in 1937. Our state has always been a leader in housing, and in the 1940s, we passed a state program to create family housing funded by the state of Massachusetts. So around the Commonwealth, there are many family public housing developments that were funded by the state, not the federal government. Then in the 50s, Massachusetts realized they needed to do more than just family housing. There was a need for housing for our senior population and disabled individuals. So they created additional housing programs, again, to run through local housing authorities to build elderly housing and disabled housing. The two developments that we have in Winchester that provide funding were funded through some of these programs. In the 1960s, the federal government decided that maybe it was a good idea to include the private sector. And instead of all of this housing being built only by public agencies, to provide some low interest loans and subsidies to start to encourage the private sector to build affordable housing. So in reality, kind of a new industry was born where developers were not just looking at building for the private market, they were looking at tapping into federal government programs to be able to build affordable housing. And actually the company that I worked for 30 years was formed when one of the partners left his brother's company because his brother did not want to have anything to do with the government and wanted to continue to build conventional housing. And he decided there was an opportunity here in the public domain and started a new company to actually take advantage of some of these programs. In 1969, Massachusetts passed Chapter 40B. I think those of you who have been learning about housing know a bit about that. This is our Commonwealth's legislation, which encourages communities to provide affordable housing throughout the Commonwealth and sets a goal of 10% affordable housing in every community and allows developers to be able to go to the state for permits if they are in fact encountering opposition in communities to their affordable housing developments. So Massachusetts was again a trailblazer by passing this legislation in the late 60s to create the comprehensive permit legislation, Chapter 40B. In the 1970s, a kind of a new idea came out, which were vouchers. And these were vouchers which basically said, let's let tenants, eligible tenants, take the money and go and rent an apartment with a private landlord. So instead of the federal government targeting subsidies to particular buildings, this was a program where tenants could choose where they wanted to live and take that voucher with them to the landlord to help pay the rent. It's kind of interesting. Massachusetts had a part in building this program. There was an experimental pilot program that started throughout the country, and one of them was in Springfield that proved that this voucher kind of program could work, and it became part of the federal government's platform and programs in the 1970s. In 1986, a major new federal program came into existence, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. Some people call it by their acronym called LIHTC, L-I-H-T-C. This program, again, is targeted toward incentivizing private developers, private investors to build, own, and operate affordable housing. And it has become a very popular program throughout the country. It's actually been one of the most long-lasting of the federal programs targeted to incentivize the private sector. And provides a significant amount of affordable housing throughout the country, targeted to residents who have incomes at 60% of median income or less. And finally, in the year 2000, Massachusetts created the Community Preservation Act. This is a provision in our state law where communities can choose to add an extra tax bill or an extra payment to fund local projects that provide affordable housing or historic preservation or community public recreation through the Community Preservation Act. So this is not a tool that we have in Winchester. There are many communities around the Commonwealth that have this program, and one of the big advantages of this program is that it provides money to the community itself, where the community can decide what kinds of projects they want to fund. So it's really an example of local control where communities can target their resources to make improvements in their own communities. Next slide. So there's subsidies, right? So the way these programs work is obviously lower income people cannot afford to pay rents high enough to make sure buildings are built and maintained. So the federal government and other parts of the government provide funding to make that happen. The federal government, through primarily the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, provides money to the states for housing. And they also fund a very significant program, the Community Development Block Grant Program, which we are not eligible for in Winchester as an entitlement community, but we could apply and tap into some funds that are available for housing and other community development resources. At the state level, the primary actor in the Commonwealth for most of our housing programs is the Department of Housing and Community Development, fondly known in our business as DHCD. And they are the entity that really disperses the money they get from HUD, as well as the money that comes from the state, our state housing programs that I mentioned earlier, as well as allocating the low-income housing tax credits to developers. So DHCD really holds the purse strings for a lot of the money that's coming out for building new development. And they create an annual plan for how that's going to be done. They determine priorities and then hold a competition for that funding. So developers need to go in to apply for funding. It's very competitive because in the Commonwealth, there are many development projects that are interested in having state housing financing and tax credits. So it is not uncommon for a development to have to apply for funds 2 or 3 times before they actually receive the funding. So it is very competitive. One of the good things now with the funding from the American Rescue Plan is that there will be significant additional funding for housing. So perhaps our housing pipeline of development deals may actually be able to get funding maybe in 1 or 2 rounds instead of 2 or 3 in the next couple of years because of that funding that's available. And on the local level, there's also funding that would, again, come directly from local communities to developments in their towns. So the Community Preservation Act, or CPA, that I mentioned before, where that's available in communities. Many communities also have local housing trusts. We in Winchester have just created that in the past couple of years. And the Select Board has funded the housing trust with some payments they've received from developers who built housing in town. So the housing trust has a little bit of money to be able to figure out what projects might be able to be actually built or accelerated with some additional resources. Next slide. So who's involved in affordable housing development? There are really lots and lots of actors, but Andrea and I spent a bunch of time trying to kind of shorten this list to make it easy to understand. There are local housing authorities, so like our Winchester Housing Authority. They own and operate public housing. They manage the Section 8 voucher process, so they receive a certain number of vouchers and they help do all the work to certify tenants' incomes, inspect apartments, and keep that program going. In Winchester, our housing authority actually owns a couple of units that have been either purchased through the town or developed in other ways. So they do, in some cases, if they have access to resources, they could buy a building or an apartment or a condo and actually rent it out as public housing. So housing authorities have a lot of capability to own and operate housing. There is not significant money around for them to develop new housing. So that's one of the challenges. Most housing authorities are mostly in the management and operating business. And then there are private sector affordable housing developers. So these companies construct, own, and operate privately owned buildings that will be created with the support of federal, state, and local funding, basically to make the numbers work and to provide enough funding so low-income people can afford to live there. Affordable housing developers can be for-profit or nonprofit entities, and they really are typically companies that solely focus on affordable housing. It's a very complicated alphabet soup of government agencies, of funding, very different sources of debt financing, very different sources of equity financing. So it's really a very, very specialized industry. In Massachusetts, we have a very robust affordable housing development community of, again, both for-profits and nonprofit entities that are working hard to create more affordable housing. And then there are what I would call conventional market developers, the companies that typically would own and operate 40B developments. These tend to be the same kinds of developers that would build just a conventional apartment building. A 40B development is not heavily subsidized. The requirements are a minimum of 25% of the units at 80% of median income. So they are, some people would say, moderate income housing. So these developers tap into more traditional forms of financing. They'll go to a conventional lender and get debt. They'll get equity from people who invest in conventional apartment real estate. And so they're more like conventional apartment developers. All of these entities, if they have any regulated or income restricted apartments, will be reviewed by public entities to make sure they comply with income requirements, to make sure they comply with some building quality standards. So it continues to be a regulated business even after the buildings are built, to make sure that there's compliance with all of the rules that come attached with either the funding or with the zoning approval under 40B. Depending on who gives the subsidy, there could be a different monitoring agency for the developments. And of course, the lenders and investors, the people who actually put money into these deals, also have review and oversight and are watching what's happening and making sure that the developments are maintained by the general partners and operators and stay an asset to the affordable housing inventory. Next slide. So let's drill down a little bit and look at the numbers about affordable housing in the state and in Winchester specifically. So in Massachusetts, we have around 190,000 affordable units. That means units, for this purpose, we're using the definition of 80% of median income or below that are targeted to that population. There are also about 86,000 vouchers. So these Section 8 vouchers that can move from apartment to apartment with a tenant and be used in the private sector. In Winchester, we have both rental affordable housing and homeownership affordable housing. So these numbers just give you a sense of our inventory. We have at the moment 124 units that are owned by the Housing Authority in Winchester, and there are 18 units. That's a Section 8. I think many of you may know Noonan Glen. That's a Section 8 assisted development in Winchester. We have 2 40B projects that are permitted and in fact have both, I think, pulled their building permits. They're close. They're just about starting construction if they haven't started already, totaling about 243 units. And then we do have some income restricted home ownership. So these are for sale buildings. Some of them are condos within existing buildings. Some of them are maybe part of a 2-family. And these ownership units are sold to income eligible people. But then on resale, there are restrictions to make sure that the next buyer is also an affordable buyer. So there's a complicated analysis of how much, how the price is set and how much profit the buyer can take out in order to make it continue to be eligible and available to low and moderate income buyers. In Winchester, we have some affordable ownership units that are targeted to 80% of median income, and some that are targeted to higher percentages of income, 100% of income of AMI. I'm just noting this because as we get to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about our subsidized housing inventory. So not all of our deed restricted ownership units can be counted in our subsidized housing inventory. So I know that's probably a lot of complicated gobbledygook, but hopefully the next slide will show that a little more clearly. We also have 143 vouchers that the Housing Authority has to make available to low and moderate income tenants. About 50% of those are used outside of Winchester. And a lot of that is because there are not apartments available in Winchester at the rent levels these vouchers will pay to allow residents to use them inside Winchester. So increasing our supply of rental housing in town might also allow us to be able to increase the utilization of these Section 8 vouchers in town. Next slide. So this is trying to simplify a very complicated thing, which is our Chapter 40B goal, which is to have at least 10% of our housing stock qualify for the subsidized housing inventory. The state, through DHCD, compiles this list. And so every unit that's on our approved list has to be approved by DHCD. And the 10% is calculated based on our housing stock, the number of housing units we actually have in town. The last census established that number as 7,920 units in town. We know that's gone up. We all see housing being built, and every housing unit that gets built adds to our housing stock. We did an update of that when we put together this town's housing production plan in 2016. We were at 8,104 units. The 2020 census number is not out yet, but I'm sure it's going to be a bit higher than 8,104. So our goal will be going up to continue to be 10% of whatever our housing stock is. The state's analysis of our housing units has documented that we have 296 affordable housing units on our official subsidized housing inventory as of December 2020. If you Google subsidized housing inventory Winchester, you'll find a list that has this number on it. That includes some things and it doesn't include other things. So what I've done is I've added in the next bullet point what we will have when both of the 40B developments at River Street and at Cambridge Street, when both of those are included on the inventory. And there's some individual ownership units, low income deed restricted units at Dick Street, Winning Farm, and on Elmwood Ave that are not yet counted in our inventory. When those are all counted, we will have 396 units, or we'll be just about 5%, halfway to our goal of 10%. Unfortunately, when the census comes out, we will probably drop back down below the 5% because these numbers will decrease when the census number goes up higher than the 2010 number of 7,920. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea now. When we get further into the discussion, happy to take questions if I have not totally confused everybody with the alphabet soup of housing and all of our Winchester numbers. So Andrea.
Thank you, Marty. Again, my name is Andrea Adams. I live next door. Previous slide, please. I live next door in Woburn, but just to augment what Lenora said, I actually worked in Rutland, Vermont, not Virginia. So I've been working in the New England region since I began my professional career over 20 plus years in regional and local planning, dealing with land use and affordable housing matters. So I know some about what is going on in Winchester because I also am involved in Town Day in Winchester. So anyway, for now, these slides are trying to focus on Winchester's issues, but they're also general in that they'd apply anywhere. So who are the key local players? And they're listed on this slide. I think I want to highlight that really the most important player in affordable housing is the community. And that was hammered home based on my experience in Watertown, that without the community support, Watertown couldn't have made the strides in changing its zoning and doing things related to progressive land use planning and permitting that occurred while I was there between 2014 and 2019. But there was also a strong relationship between the executive, which in the case of Watertown was a town council with a C, and a town administrator. But in Winchester, it's the select board, town manager, your various permitting boards, your housing authority, the housing partnership, and the trust. All of them work together to create the affordable housing programs. Next slide. So what local policies affect affordable housing? Again, this is not just Winchester, but this is my experience in working in land use planning and affordable housing, and watching it both from a regional perspective on Cape Cod, where you had 15 towns working together in a consortium, and then watching it from my employment in Watertown. Again, community engagement is the key, because that's what's going to bring the information and the, I don't want to say pressure, but the desire at the local level to make some of these programs happen. But you have to have also the select board and town manager or the executive branch engaged, because they're the ones that are going to make those programs happen, and to work on some of the minutia of things like a 40B development, as you've seen with the Waterfield. Your comprehensive plan and your housing production plan, they need to be in the mix. They can't just be documents that sit on a shelf and you only look at it every few years. I use both the comprehensive plan and the housing production plan daily in what I did in Watertown when I was the housing planner. And I was responsible for program administration, program creation, monitoring affordable housing units, interfacing with the Department of Housing and Community Development, setting the rent levels for all of the affordable units, no matter what they were, except for the housing authority. They had a full staff on the housing authority that dealt with those units independently. I'm talking about all the non-housing authority units that were in Watertown. I was the monitor that did that. I was the program manager. I didn't work on fixing broken windows and things, because that was the responsibility of the actual development team, or if it was a finished project, the actual operator of a building that affordable units in it. But I did everything else to ensure that the rents were set at the appropriate income level to make, soup to nuts. And then finally, planning and zoning is important, because without those tools, a community really can't incentivize affordable housing development and weave it into the community's desire for its future, because that comes from your comprehensive plan and your zoning. So they all work together hand in glove as a unified whole to create and promote affordable housing. Next slide. Now, sorry for the sort of sloppy hand-drawnness of this, but it's something I created over my 5 years in Watertown, where people would go, what? What's affordable housing? What is where? What's AMI? Who does what? So if you think about housing as a pyramid like this, on the lowest level is everybody, right? Who can afford to buy housing no matter what, whether it's ownership or rental or anything in between. That's market rate units at the bottom. And then going up to the tippy top is shelter. In other words, Pine Street Inn, Rosie's Place, the Waltham Day Shelter, you name it. So when you go up the pyramid towards the tippy top, you go towards poverty. When you go down the pyramid from the tippy top to the bottom, you go through to wealth. All right, so the more money you have, you're at the bottom of the pyramid. The less money you have, you're at the top because you can't afford housing. And that's sort of the slide rule is on my left. On the right, in the red, is a broader description of how to look at that sliding scale of money, right? Follow the money. At the tippy top, if you're in shelter, you got no money. You're poor, you're homeless. It goes, that's just the way it is. If you're at the bottom, on the wider part, the base of the pyramid, you got enough money to rent or buy at market rate. That's just the way it is. Again, housing for all types is on the bottom. No housing homeless is at the tip. And as you can go either way, up the pyramid or down the pyramid. And in the red, it shows you who is where in terms of what kind of housing they end up getting. So I'm going to start at the top with the shelter people. You got no money, you're in shelter. You're staying at the Pine Street Inn. If you've got a little bit of money, you're in the housing authority units. They're the ones that get you the Section 8 vouchers, and they're sitting at extremely low income. And all of these definitions are set by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So if you're extremely low income, you're 30% of area median income. The next one down towards market rate is home program. Home is a program that Winchester doesn't use, but it is available as a tool, and its tranche of income is anywhere from 50 to 60% of area median income, and it overlaps. So if you're in the housing authority, you go from 30 to 50. And then you, below that, going on, you go to low-income tax credits. Those are the tax credits that Marty talked about. They generally sit at 55 to 60% of area median income. And then again, going down towards wealth, you have inclusionary zoning units. Those are not 40B units. Those are units that are created by a town through its inclusionary zoning requirements, meaning if you're a developer and you're going to do a market rate project, now 40B, you must set aside X number of units as affordable. And in the green at the very bottom, and I apologize for that, it shows Winchester's requirements. If a project has 6 or more units, 10% of them have to be set aside at 80% area median income. If it's 25 or more units, 10% of those resultant units have to be set aside at 80% area median income, and 5% of the resultant units have to be set aside at, I think, 100, it says 80%, but it should say 100, I think, to 120. So my apologies for that. But anyway, as you can see, the poorer you are, the less access you have. The richer you are, the more access you have. And it describes the funding sources. So shelters get money from the state grants, their rent income, and you say shelter, rent? Yes, the Pine Street Inn rents some of its space to tenants, right? So if you have a big enough building, you can get money that way. You don't collect rent from homeless people, and they get it from donations. Housing Authority gets federal and state grants and rent income from their units. Lots of times they don't get enough money to break even. The only one that I know of in the state that's getting there may be two of them, was I'm pleased to say, the Watertown Housing Authority was close to being in the black, not even making a profit. And their rents were sitting, when I left in 2019, at $350 a month all in, meaning $350 a month for everything that the landlord, quote unquote, would provide. So think of it as a traditional rental apartment. That means that you're paying, if you're living in the Watertown Housing Authority units, you're paying for your own cable and your consumables and your internet, but everything else is provided by the Housing Authority as your landlord, and that rent is sitting at $350. Home program gets money from HUD, Housing Urban Development, and state grants. Remember that federal money is a pass-through. It goes from the feds to the states, from HUD to the Department of Housing and Community Development. And then again, at the very, very bottom, you can see Winchester's inclusionary zoning requirements. Next slide. So Watertown. What did Watertown do? And they're your next door neighbor. And this is an ordinance that I worked on. And the reason why it's ordinance is that Watertown is their official name is the city known as the town of Watertown. They're very proud of their town history, but they changed from a select board form of government to a town council. There are 9 council members that act as the executive and the ultimate legislative branch. They do not have town meeting. They operate as a city form of government. So in a city, you have an ordinance. What did Watertown do? Well, they have had a affordable housing requirement on the books since about 1980. And when I was there, it started out as 12%, 10%. Then I worked in concert with a whole bunch of the actors that I showed on the previous slide. It went up to 12%. And then when I left, they said, not good enough. And when I say they, I mean the town council and the planning and zoning board and the planning office, of which I was part. And the community said, not good enough. We're getting projects hand over fist. We need to create more units or we're never going to get to 10%. So when I left, it was 2-tiered based on project size. There was no contribution to affordable housing if it was less than 5 units or lots. But if it was a project of 6 to 19 units, it was 12.5% set aside. If the project was 20 or more units, it was 15% set aside. And if a project had greater than 20 units, there were 2 income tiers for rental. And you can see those on the slide. 5% had to be at 65% and 10% had to be at 80%. The town, or yeah, it is a town, the town of Watertown, had a very aggressive home ownership program based on them having had community development block grant funds back in the early 80s and 90s. They had some units, about, I forget how many units they had that I was administering. But anyway, those homeownership projects, because there was a possibility of developers creating units for sale. And the reason why that figure was left at 80% is that we didn't, and I can say we because I participated, want the homeowners to literally go, it's a term, go underwater with their mortgage, right? We've all heard about the time in this country when if you had a pulse, you could get a mortgage. Well, homeownership projects from the Department of Housing and Community Development, you have to have a certain amount of cash in the bank to participate. And if you don't, if you're a first-time home buyer, and literally this is your first home, you might be on a knife's edge in terms of scraping together enough money to put down a down payment, even with public programs available from the Department of Housing and Community Development. So we left it at 80% area median income. Because as you know, if you're a homeowner, once you buy a house, it doesn't stay that way. You have to fix stuff. The landlord doesn't do it, you do, and you have to have capital to be able to do that. So we debated whether we should drop the ownership percentage, but the concerted opinion was no, because those first-time home buyers don't have enough in the bank potentially to be able to fund a home repair. Well, as much as we wanted people to get into home ownership units, if you're sitting at 65% area median income or 50% area median income, you just don't have the money. A cash contribution, we changed it from the standard contribution is usually quite low. And this came from my work with the Cape Cod Commission. We had a very aggressive housing program at the commission, and even so, the money would sit there and not, units wouldn't get built because we'd get all this money in a pot and it'd sit there a couple of years until a project came along. And we all know about the dollar value of money. As it sits there, it loses buying power. So we said, okay, we are going to base the contribution if you want to do a buyout of units. In other words, you want to remove yourself from providing units on site. We created a cost based on the Department of Housing and Community Development's actual cost in 2016, which was the latest information available at the time, to create a unit of affordable housing in the Watertown area. And this is based on number of bedrooms. So there's some thought that went into this. So it's 329,000 to 349,000. And we used that information because it was defensible, right? It wasn't just, oh yeah, we've, figured that one out. No, this is real data based on projects that the Department of Community and Housing Development funded for that project year, which, as I said, was the latest available when this was put into the zoning ordinance. Next slide. So again, I'm sorry for the busyness, but I created this because I was getting questions from the community and from the town council. How are we doing? Where are we going? What's happening? So SHI is the subsidized housing inventory. And a good thing to note, as Marty said, is that the subsidized housing inventory is based on the census. So even though you're chugging along and you're like, great, it's been, it's not 2010 and we're doing so good. Your number is based on the 2010 census, which is kind of a false promise, because once the next census rolls around, all of that growth between 2010 and when the next numbers are created, including the affordable units themselves, way into what, the denominator? Anyway, so you lose traction. It's, one step forward, two steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. You're constantly chasing that 10% goal. So if you're not creating units relatively often, you're just going to slide further and further behind. And that's one of the reasons why Watertown said, we've had it. Let's up the housing set aside. We're never going to get there. So you can see the census from 2008, their housing units, they had 979, and then their percentage was 6.5. And that's again due to programs that they'd had historically before I got there. And then I did a lot of work to get historic units that had never been counted on the SHI, because that process is complicated. You don't just say, great, we got it. They're permitted, right? They're going to count. You have to petition DHCD to put them on the SHI by showing building permits, by showing occupancy permits, by showing the land use special permit that was created when the project was built, or permitted rather, to show that they actually are restricted units. They won't count them if you just say, oh yeah, trust us. Not happening. So that's why you see the jump between 2008 and 2017, because I put more units on the books that have been sitting there, because the planning office, even though they had a director, a planner, a clerk, a historical commission clerk, nobody had time to do it. So they hired myself, and they hired a transportation planner while I was there. They did some other hiring after I left. So even with a staff of 4 or 5, I was doing housing work more than 20 hours a week. I was probably doing 2/3, 1/3, or sometimes more, depending upon what was in the hopper for me to deal with. And the units at the bottom will show you what were the projects that were in the units. 1060 Belmont had been developed by a community development organization, CDC. Coolidge was an old school that was converted. Marshall was a project built with home funds, and there were 2 in a project called Nally, because it was a private development that they required 2 units at the time. Nally was very old, so the percentage was very low. And you note that the subsidized housing inventory includes housing authority units, and in Watertown included group homes, Beaverbrook Step, which is for developmentally disabled individuals, Marshall Place, as I noted, St. Joseph Hall. St. Joseph Hall was is a former school and religious retreat for retired, I should say, living facility for retired religious, and it was purchased by a community development organization and converted into 100% affordable. And first-time homebuyers, those were low interest, no interest loans and grants to using community development block grant funds to allow first-time homebuyers to purchase their first home, and it would pay down payment assistance and closing costs and some other things. And Repton, Charles Bank, Bell, Riverbend, Muse, and River Park Lofts were all apartment blocks, for-profit apartment blocks that the zoning ordinance required to have units in it. Next slide. And again, I apologize for the teeny weeny text, but I think you can get the gist. As the reference year goes from 2017 at the top to 2020 or later, you can see the 2010 census. New housing units by BP, that's by building permit. Growth, which is new housing units by building permit plus census. The next column is subsidized housing inventory units. The next one is new affordable units to be added. That means one still in the permitting process, not yet built, not yet ripe for at the time me to take that data and petition DHCD to add it to the housing inventory. And then the projection, and you can see the notes. And if you wouldn't mind, Lenora, can you scroll down a little to show the bottom of the slide? Oops, I guess not. That's okay, but essentially you can see the same data at the bottom. And if you look very closely at the bottom, in 2018, there was the Gables, 30 units, 2019, Lawn and Watermills, those are project names. And 2020 or later, Arsenal Yards, 33 Mount Auburn, and 385 Pleasant. Those were all mixed use and or pure housing rentals. They were all rentals by for-profit developers that were required to have units. So, and a lot of them, particularly Arsenal Yards, came in when the affordable housing ordinance, the percentage set aside was increased. Next slide. And I want to say one more thing before I get to this. A lot of people would say 15%. Are you crazy? You have, we also, when I was there, took a look at communities that were around Watertown. Cambridge at the time was thinking about upping their affordable housing percentage to 20%. And again, are you nuts? People will go 40B. Well, what Marty didn't say, and she can certainly address it, is that was a concern in Watertown, because even though development at the time was hotter than a pistol, the community wanted to be business friendly, and there's nothing wrong with that. What that means is adjusting your zoning and your planning and permitting to a way that the developer understands at the beginning what they're going to get out the back end of the project. And that was my experience over my career, is that if you don't do that, developers are going to scoop. But what's really interesting is that Marty said that in 40B or comprehensive permit project case, it's 25%. Well, the other thing you have to do if you're a 40B is you have to open your books. They have to get a look at your pro forma and your sources and uses of funds. So in some situations, not all, increasing your affordable housing set aside is not necessarily detrimental to for-profit developers coming in and actually using your ordinance to develop units. That was the case in Watertown. It's also important to note that, oh, I just lost my train of thought, but that's okay. It'll come to me. That if they really want in, developers will do that, because I know what it is. That out of a clear zoning, planning, and land use program, they can get certainty and understand the regulations where they don't have to open their books for public scrutiny. So sometimes even with a high set aside percentage, developers can still decide to come into a community and do whatever it is they want to do. Next slide. So what are the lessons learned? And I've been in planning for my entire professional career, over 20 years. And I've sat through plenty of these presentations, and it always bothered me that I'd go to a conference or I go to a presentation and I'm sitting there waiting, it's fascinating, but I want to get to what did they do? And I get there and it's like, okay, well, I can't do that, because all of the stuff that they usually put up is like, well, I went to the housing conference in New Orleans. They have some really innovative programs, but a lot of them are because they're in Louisiana and in New Orleans, and they have certain state or local allowances or regulations that allow them to do things. So I'm like, darn. So I really worked hard on this slide so that it would be universal. So number one, for gosh sakes, don't reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of really smart folks all over the country, locally, wherever. They've done it. Steal, beg, borrow, rob, plagiarize. A lot of people in the planning community have no problem with that. They don't want to waste their time reinventing something that somebody's already not only invented, but tested. Second, community involvement and knowledge is key. Couldn't have done what Watertown did, even though it has a fundamentally different tax base than Winchester, with a lot of non-residential property. Couldn't have done those changes without community involvement. When the set aside went from 10 to 12 and 12 to 15, the development community screamed bloody murder. And when I say the development community, I mean the private for-profit developments. Without community involvement, that never would have changed. They said, no, we're Watertown. This is what we want. You can either pay, or you can either deal with it, or you can go somewhere else. Publicize and implement your, I should have also put the comprehensive plan. Put the plans that you have in play, do stuff. Like I said, I use the comprehensive plan and the housing production plan, if not daily, at least once a week, to make sure I was meeting those milestones, because Watertown would be eligible for grants, and if nothing else, bragging rights. Partner with the housing authority, partner with anybody. We had a very active housing authority in Watertown when I was there. The director, Brian Costello, who's since retired, came up through the ranks and was a facilities manager until he became director. And remember I said that the housing authority sits at 30 to 50 area median income. Well, the bulk of the units in Watertown were home program or inclusionary zoning units. And only recently did they have the percentage set at 65%. So for a long time, there was a gap between where the housing authority units stopped and where the other affordable units started in terms of the area median income. So he was very interested in any changes to the zoning ordinance that would bridge that gap between 50% area median income where his tenancy stopped and where the next tranche of affordable housing units started, because he had nowhere for his tenants to go. They would do everything they should do, save their money, get better jobs, whatever, but still not achieve that 80% area median income where they could even get the next tranche of affordable housing. So he basically said to me several times, I've got single people in my family units, 2 and 3 bedroom. I can't put them on the street. They got nowhere to go. Use all your tools, planning, zoning, grants, subsidies, anything. And yes, I saw the chat pop up, comprehensive plan, master plan. It's the plan that the community creates that deals with what the community's future is. And every one of them has to have a housing element. And typically the housing element and the other elements dovetail. So monitor, 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 because 90% of the time, especially the not-for-profits or the public entities like the housing authority, they own their units, they know their tenants, they're already under supervision by federal state monitors. So it's the other ones that if you have any private units that you need to monitor, because at least at the time that I was in Watertown, a lot of them didn't know housing. Why should they? They're busy fixing broken pipes and unclogging toilets. They need somebody to monitor those income levels and help them navigate that. And the other thing is that in Watertown, the manager of the for-profit affordable housing or projects that had affordable housing units in them changed about every 12 months. It's not a glamorous job to do that. So every year I was educating another tranche of program or building managers to say, no, you haven't quite met those eligibility requirements. And that's another thing. If you don't monitor the units and somebody's over income, they shouldn't be living there. This housing is not supposed to be permanent housing. It's supposed to be turned over as people do what they're supposed to do and follow the American dream, gain more funds, gain more money, gain more income, get better jobs. They move on. And so that opens up residency for new people. Not so much perhaps in the housing authority, because a lot of those people might age in place, if you understand what I'm saying, but the other types of units. Keep your SHI updated. Well, as you can see from what I did in Watertown, a lot of the units were eligible, but they were just sitting there because no one did the paperwork. The last two, I think, are the most important that I learned the hard way through my career. Think through the intended and unintended consequences. I would oftentimes, and I still do thought experiments. If then this happens, and I try to think through what the outcome's going to be. And as a community, that's valuable because you want to ensure that the policies that you have in place create the outcome that you want. So you've got to think that through. If you want A, how are you going to get to A? Are you going to use this path and get to A, or are you going to use this other path that you think will get you to the outcome you want, but doesn't? So that's really, really important. Another good example of that is in Woburn. There's a project in North Woburn that you may have heard about. It's a gravel pit. Well, it's a gravel pit right now, but originally it was proposed to be a traditional subdivision. And I'm not trashing the community members, but they didn't like it. So through a series of backs and forths and sales and bankruptcies and a lot of invective going back and forth, it's going to be a 40B, but it's a hill. So for the past couple of years, the developer has been removing the gravel out of the hill to flatten the site for development. And that means gravel crushing, rock crushing operation has been going on 6 days a week, 8 a.m. to regular business hours. So, and the 40B has density in it. I don't know exactly how many units, but it's certainly denser than a traditional subdivision. So think through what the consequences are of every action, because it's not cut and dried, not in the development world. Somebody's got an angle, they're going to see a piece of property as an investment. And that's primarily in the for-profit development community, but not always. Nonprofit developers also have a vision that they're trying to enact. Usually it aligns with the community's goals, but you still have to think about what it is the community wants and find the individual entity, company, whatever, to help implement that vision. And last, think like a developer, for-profit or nonprofit. And like I said, one of the key things I learned was if the developer, regardless of whether they're for or nonprofit, can't figure out in their pro forma what the permitting process is going to cost them and how long it's going to take, they'll go look for greener pastures, because time is money. And especially now, everybody's experienced the increase in prices for building materials. They can't wait. If they don't know that the project's going to reasonably get through the development process in X months or whatever, they can't wait. The cost of wood and other materials may go up, may go down. The supply chain crunch has driven that home. Next slide. So that's all I have for my part.
Great. Okay. So thank you, Andrea. There's a lot we know we can learn from other communities. And, it's interesting that in contrast to Winchester's inclusionary zoning for our downtown, our CBD zoning, we have 2 tiers starting at 80% and then going higher. Watertown took the different tack to have 2 tiers with a lower income tier and then an 80% tier. So it just goes to show that there are lots of different ways that this housing issue can be discussed and decided in local communities. I'm cognizant of time, and looks like we only have about 20 minutes left for tonight's conversation. I think I'd like to see if people have questions. I know we've thrown a lot at you, and I know I tend to talk very quickly, so I'm sure I went through things quickly. So maybe we could pause and see if people have questions about any particular things that we talked about, or want to pick Andrea's brain or mine about some housing issues. So shall we just open it to questions? People, I think, can either raise their hands, Leora, is that right? Or
I I just
But-
want to remind people that we are recording, so happy for people just to jump and say, yes, I have a question, or you can put your questions in the chat. I do see one from Zena here about the pyramid that Andrea presented. Does it also reflect the number of people, families in each category? So most people fall in the market rate units and the least number
Yeah.
of people fall in the shelter. I was wondering that too at the base of the triangle.
Yeah, it's more of an illustrative diagram. I didn't do any specific counting of who's where, but I think it's pretty obvious that you kind of hit the nose on the head, or did I get that right? Anyway, that most of the United States is in the bottom half or in the base of the pyramid, and fewer American citizens are in the peak. I don't know what the exact spread is.
Yeah,
And
it's probably not as neat as the pyramid.
No.
It goes exactly up. The distribution is probably not so.
Oh yeah, I just did an inch for each tranche because it made it look pretty.
Yeah.
So there's another question from Marilyn in the chat. I realize our target will change with the 2020 census. This is a great question, but is 5% considered reasonable progress?
That's kind of a hard question to say whether, I mean, it's progress, which is fantastic. And every bit of progress we can make is great. I think, the housing production plan outlined a goal for Winchester of 40 units a year. So really, moving the needle that much every year. And we have not been able to do that. We kind of have had this, what I would call lumpy progress, because we have the larger developments that are coming in, but we haven't been able to exactly measure it out at the 40 units a year.
What I would say, even though I said, implement your plans, is if you don't make any progress, you gotta, I would echo what she said. Watertown was able to make significant progress for a number of reasons. And one of the things I would add is this is in no way, shape, or form to be a knock on your planning department. I think Brian Zelski and his colleagues and your board should be commended for working with the tools that you have. This is just some things that I learned looking at the regional and local perspective.
So we have another question here about safe harbor, and that's just what percent gets us to safe harbor. But maybe, I always get questions about safe harbor. So I think it might be worth sort of reiterating what it is, what it isn't, and what percent gets us there.
Yeah, so safe harbor basically means that if a community produces a certain amount of housing, they can be in safe harbor. That means a developer cannot come in and use the 40B comprehensive permit to essentially have the leverage to go to the state if the town does not grant a permit. And our standard based on the housing production plan is meeting at least the 40 units a year. So it's kind of a moving target. If you get the 40 units, you've got a year of safe harbor. If you get 80 units, I think you get 2 years. But it gets complicated as to what counts.
Mm-hmm.
For example, 416 Cambridge Street pulling their building permit will not count getting us to safe harbor because it was actually permitted before we did our housing production plan. And so under the rules, it doesn't count. So the kind of the procedures around it are fairly complicated.
Watertown is not at, well, I should say two things. One, Watertown had a 40B that was proposed in 2008, but fell apart because of the housing crash. And it did not have a 40B proposed while I was there until really late in my tenure. And the developer was a for-market developer and wanted to put a self-storage facility in. And the planning department, including myself, said, No, the self-storage facility is not suitable for that site. And he essentially said, okay, then I'm going to 40B it. Well, the town was able to use another land calculation to achieve safe harbor, which is land use or land area. And I won't go into what that means, but I'm happy to say that Watertown won. So if you ever need that calculation, you can use their method. But my point is, even with a very aggressive set aside, Watertown did not have a 40B.
So I'm not sure there's more questions from the chat. Oh, yes, there is. And it's very similar to my question. Great. Zena says, what are our next steps? Is the next step for our community pulling apart our housing production plan and master plan to create a focused campaign? Like, do we already have all the information in these plans and it's about narrowing in, or what as a community should we do? A little plug, the Network for Social Justice is working to build a grassroots community organizing campaign around this. We've got some great sort of strategists and executive thinkers among us. We also have quite a few concerned citizens who have been working on this issue for a while now and sort of mobilizing each other. We also have the Network for Social Justice that's really working on the educational part of this movement. What are our next steps?
So I want to echo what Andrea said, use your existing tools. We have a housing production plan. There are lots of ideas in the housing production plan about what Winchester can start looking at as possibilities to begin to move the needle on this. There are a number of possible zoning changes. None of them are an immediate magic, solution to it, but I think, yes, definitely pulling apart the housing production plan and really looking at what's in there for recommendations and talking about what's doable and what might make a difference.
And I have to say that I'm going to put in a plug because where you sit determines what you see. As I said, my whole career was in land use planning. No offense, you can't do it with a planning staff of one and a clerk. It's not going to happen. There's way too much going on in Winchester, even from my perch here in Woburn being mildly, no offense, being mildly interested, to have one person and dedicated staff, doing all of this, with kudos to him and with kudos to Marty Jones on the partnership for getting those units on the subsidized housing inventory. You need more staff. And I don't know if that's through the trust or you got to have somebody whose bread and butter is doing this. And like I said, I in Watertown was maybe 50% or 60% land use and 40% housing. And that was because Watertown had a lot of housing units to deal with. But, the poor man, no offense, I would be going bonkers if I was trying to manage everything he's doing and land use planning. And I'm sorry to sound like a rain in the puss,
That's one of the things that was, mentioned, and I think is actually a recommendation in the housing production plan. I have to admit, I haven't read it recently, but there was a lot of discussion, around the table that, this it's complicated in a town like ours because we don't have a lot of development sites that are there and ready to go, and you just negotiate with who walks in the door. It's very complicated to come up with strategies where we can really continue to build more affordable units.
Yeah, but, and I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but if you had someone that could have some mental or programmatic focus, then you could devote some specific time to that endeavor, which would really help you make progress that was appropriate for your development pattern in Winchester, because you can't copy Watertown. Watertown's Watertown, Winchester's Winchester, but you would still have that housing focus.
We have one or two more questions coming into the chat, so I'm going to try to pack everything in while we can. I have a question about vouchers, but you know what? I think so does someone else. We're a little bit confused by the 50% and the holders outside of Winchester. Do
Mhm.
they remain Winchester residents as long as they hold the vouchers or
No.
move to Winchester?
No,
Okay,
they just, like, it's like getting a ticket, right? They get their ticket from the housing authority, they get their voucher from the housing authority, but wherever they are living, whether it's, right across the line in Woburn, or whether it's, next door to their daughter who might live in Arlington, they would become a resident of that town. It's just their housing subsidy that's coming through the vehicle of the Winchester Housing Authority.
okay.
And because I did the monitoring, I monitored several people that were in those private for-profit developments that had vouchers. We had people from Springfield living in Watertown. I know because I looked at their tax records. The housing vouchers is a statewide program that you're put in on the list. And the wait list for a voucher is up to 10 plus years. And when your number comes up, you have 3 chances to use a voucher. And if the next voucher available for you and you're living in Watertown or wherever you can, or in Winchester, is in Holyoke, that's where you go. If you refuse, you go to the bottom of the list.
Okay, I'm monitoring the chat here. We've got sort of a mix of big macro questions about where do we go from here, and we've had very specific, okay, we need to understand the voucher better, tell us about safe harbor. I think right now I want to sort of wrap up a little bit, and feel free to put more questions in the chat for the next minute or so. I have put a link to resources on the town website. Those are also in the slides that you will get. We are going to send out all the slides from this presentation to anyone who registered. This is also recorded and will also be available on WinCam. So we've got a lot of community support for this. And if you are interested in the Grassroots Housing Coalition that the network is looking to support, you may email me, the director of the network, at office@nfsj.org. And we have some great folks working in 3 different working groups to make programs like this happen.
I'm also willing offline, if Lenora wants to feed me the questions, to write an answer that can be vetted by Marty Jones as well. And if there's a platform to put that on, that would be accessible. That would be a way to answer the questions in the chat that we can't get to.
I think there's only one that I can see. I missed one, and it is, what's the timing for the select board coming back with another deal or starting over? And I believe that is related to Waterfield.
Right, for Waterfield, the select board indicated on Monday night that they were going to enter into negotiations with the currently designated developer, Civico. I don't think they have put a specific timeline on how quickly they want to renegotiate. I know they do want to move quickly to try to get to potentially a special town meeting, but I have not heard a particular specific timeline. I know that they're ready to jump in and see if they can address some of the issues that were raised during the referendum campaign and by the task force in the renegotiations. And I just want to put kudos to Paula Zakim, I know has been working to get this new information up on the town website. It is on the Winchester Housing Partnership page and has links to lots of different documents. And the goal here is to have that be the place in town people can go and find housing information. It's been difficult because it was all over the place. And I think Paula took this on and figured out a way to get it at least in one place. So let's all build on that. And when we find new information that people want to find, let's just kind of keep it in one place so that we can all get it out to people.
And I can help with that. And also, I don't want to be a stinker. Winchester has to make decisions that are best for Winchester, but 2 things. Number one, in Watertown, while I was there, they significantly reduced the parking requirements for all developments, including affordable developments, down to effectively a quarter of a space. And you do some math to come out with how many the development want. required. That was also the case in the Cape Cod Commission. Peak parking was required, and when I left, there was no such thing as peak parking. So the Cape Cod Mall, if you know that, the bulk of those spaces aren't used except for twice a year, in Christmas and one other time. So none of that. And three, just recently, WBOR reported that Boston actually reduced the parking requirement for affordable units to 0. So I just want to throw that out there. And again, I'm not trying to step on a landmine, but land use planning has found that the ratios for parking have been decreasing significantly due to other transportation modes.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions popping into the chat. I want to thank both the presenters for putting tonight together and giving us so much great information so well laid out. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for partnering with us and helping us to roll out this program. And I want to thank all of you for participating. You will be receiving the slides, and for further questions, you can approach the network, or if the presenters are willing, we can find a way also to sort of direct questions directly to them. So thank you all.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for organizing this and keeping this conversation going.
Indeed, indeed.
Usually takes people a second to log off. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Haley. I assume that's WinCam.
I assume that's WinCam. I'm going to stop recording now.